What would you do if you discovered that someone you buried years ago was never actually dead? Imagine standing at a wedding ceremony, watching a loved one say their vows, only to have that joyous moment shattered by the appearance of someone who should be nothing more than bones in the ground. Has this ever happened to you? Of course not, because what I'm about to tell you defies everything we understand about life, death, and the darkness that can hide beneath the most sacred places. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. On a crisp October morning in Millfield, Ohio, groundskeeper Walter Chen arrived at Holy Trinity Chapel expecting nothing more than routine maintenance work. The diocese had planned to expand their chapel garden, which meant relocating 3 old graves from the cemetery's edge, a simple job he'd done countless times before. But as his shovel struck the weathered cherrywood of one particular coffin, Walter had no idea he was about to uncover a truth so horrifying it would tear apart everything this small town believed about faith, trust, and the people they had placed on pedestals. The name on the headstone read Sarah Beth Morrison, a child who had supposedly died over a decade ago. When Walter lifted that coffin lid, expecting to find the familiar sight of old bones and deteriorated fabric, he instead discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The coffin was empty, completely empty, except for a single, faded pink rabbit lying at the center, its button eyes staring up at him like silent witnesses to an unspeakable deception. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next at that very same chapel would challenge everything you think you know about missing children cases and the monsters who hide in plain sight. Just hours after Walter's discovery, Claire Morrison stood in her wedding dress, preparing for what should have been the happiest day of her life. The chapel bells were ringing, guests were seated, and everything seemed perfect for her marriage to David at the very place where her family had worshipped for generations. But sometimes the dead don't stay buried, and sometimes the truth refuses to remain hidden underground. As Claire prepared to walk down the aisle, chaos erupted in the chapel garden. Guests began screaming. Children started crying, and the wedding photographer lowered his camera in shock. Walking barefoot through the perfectly manicured grass, wearing nothing but a dirt-stained pink dress, was a girl who looked impossibly, undeniably familiar. The girl was older now, her face marked by experiences no child should ever endure. But Claire recognized her immediately. It was Sarah, her sister Sarah, who had vanished without a trace 12 years earlier when she was just 9 years old. The same Sarah whose empty grave had been discovered that very morning. The same Sarah whose funeral the entire town had attended, whose coffin they had lowered into the ground, whose death had devastated the Morrison family and shocked the close-knit community of Millfield. What you're about to discover might surprise you, but this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or someone who looked similar. This was the beginning of an investigation that would reveal a network of horror hidden beneath one of the most trusted institutions in American society. Because when Sarah spoke her first words to her sister in over a decade, she didn't ask about the family she'd left behind or express joy at being reunited with her loved ones. Instead, she asked for someone else entirely, someone she called her real father. The human mind has an extraordinary ability to sense when something is fundamentally wrong, even when we can't put our finger on exactly what it is. Claire Morrison experienced this phenomenon as she stood in that antique mirror, surrounded by lace and silk that should have made her feel like a princess on her wedding day. But instead of joy, she felt a weight pressing against her chest, a darkness that seemed to whisper warnings she couldn't quite understand. This wasn't about cold feet or typical wedding jitters. Claire loved David deeply, and their 6-year relationship had been built on genuine trust and affection. Yet returning to Millfield, to the very chapel where her family had worshipped for generations, triggered something primal within her. It was as if her subconscious mind was screaming at her to pay attention, to look deeper beneath the surface of her supposedly perfect hometown. Sometimes our intuition picks up on patterns and connections that our conscious mind hasn't yet processed. Claire's unease wasn't random. It was her psyche responding to the hidden truth that was about to explode into the open. The same chapel where she was preparing to pledge her future held secrets that would transform everything she believed about her past. When that barefoot girl appeared in the garden, Claire's world didn't just shift, it completely shattered and rebuilt itself in a matter of seconds. The face looking back at her was impossible, yet undeniable. Sarah's features had matured, her body had grown, but the essence of her sister remained unmistakable. What struck Claire most wasn't just the physical recognition but the profound change in Sarah's eyes. These weren't the bright, curious eyes of the 9-year-old who had vanished 12 years ago. These eyes held depths of trauma that no child should ever experience. The transformation was devastating to witness. In that garden, surrounded by wedding guests and flowers, Claire had to confront a reality that defied logic. Her sister, supposedly dead, supposedly buried, supposedly at peace, was standing before her as living proof that everything the Morrison family had accepted as truth was actually an elaborate lie. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. Sarah's first words weren't about missing her family or being happy to see them again. Instead, she spoke about someone else entirely, someone she referred to as her real father. This revelation would soon uncover a web of deception so deep and so methodical that it would force an entire community to question everyone they had trusted. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what happened next reveals the calculated mindset of predators who use our most sacred institutions as hunting grounds. The investigation that followed Sarah's return would expose a network of manipulation and control that had been operating right under everyone's noses for over a decade. Write in the comments. Truth always surfaces, if you're ready to discover just how deep this deception really went. What makes this story even more unsettling is how it began with the most ordinary of circumstances. Walter Chen had no idea that his routine morning would become the catalyst for one of the most shocking revelations in Millfield's history. He arrived at Holy Trinity Chapel before sunrise, thermos of coffee in hand, whistling his way through the pre-dawn darkness like he had countless times before. This was supposed to be just another day of honest work, relocating a few old graves to make room for the chapel's garden expansion. The transformation from routine to revelation happened in the space of a single shovel strike. Walter had been contracted to move 3 graves from the oldest section of the cemetery, plots that dated back to the chapel's earliest days. Most contained children, souls who had been mourned and laid to rest decades ago. The community had long since accepted these peaceful endings, never questioning what lay beneath the weathered headstones. But here's what's truly chilling about the mindset of predators. They count on our assumptions, our willingness to accept surface appearances without digging deeper. Someone had deliberately chosen these old graves, knowing that community members would never suspect the deception hidden underground. The decision to use a cemetery as a cover was both brilliant and monstrous. Who would ever think to disturb the supposed final resting place of a child? The impact of Walter's discovery rippled through the wedding ceremony like an earthquake. Within minutes, Holy Trinity Chapel transformed from a place of celebration into a crime scene. The beautiful autumn morning, perfect for a wedding, suddenly felt heavy with implications that no one could yet fully comprehend. Wedding flowers began wilting in the sun as the joyful atmosphere dissolved into chaos and confusion. Claire's white dress, which should have been carefully preserved as a symbol of the happiest day of her life, instead became a haunting reminder of how quickly truth can shatter our carefully constructed realities. Champagne glasses sat untouched on reception tables as patrol cars arrived with flashing lights, their presence creating a stark contrast against the romantic decorations and family photographs. The guests dispersed in whispered conversations, each person trying to process what they had witnessed. Behind the scenes, paramedics and police officers worked to secure Sarah and transport her to Millfield General Hospital for medical evaluation. The journey from Chapel Garden to hospital represented more than just a physical transition. It was the beginning of Sarah's path back from a nightmare that most people couldn't even imagine. Now, I want to explore the deeper implications of what happened next, because the medical evaluation would reveal evidence that would force investigators to confront the systematic nature of Sarah's captivity and the carefully orchestrated deception that had fooled an entire community. Write in the comments, "Justice finds a way," if you believe that truth eventually surfaces no matter how deeply it's buried. The most chilling aspect of Sarah's return wasn't just her physical appearance, it was the way she spoke. Her voice carried an otherworldly quality that sent shivers through everyone who heard it. When she asked for her real dad, she wasn't talking about Robert Morrison, the man who had raised her for the first 9 years of her life. She was referring to someone else entirely, someone who had systematically erased her original identity and replaced it with a carefully constructed fiction. This reveals the devastating impact of psychological manipulation on developing minds. Sarah's words about wanting to go home, but not to the Morrison family home, demonstrated how completely her sense of reality had been altered. Somewhere in the shadows, another person had convinced a stolen child that their captor was their true parent, that their prison was their real home. The transformation of a victim's mindset is perhaps the most insidious weapon predators use. It ensures compliance and creates a twisted loyalty that can persist even after rescue. What made her words even more disturbing was her concern about being late, her fear that someone will be mad. This wasn't the natural worry of a child about disappointing a parent. This was the conditioned response of someone who had learned that tardiness brought punishment. Her entire demeanor suggested years of living under strict control, where every decision was monitored and every deviation from expectation carried consequences. Detective Hayes understood immediately that he was dealing with something unprecedented in his 20 years with the Millfield Police Department. As he set up his interview space in the chapel's back room, the weight of the empty coffin discovery pressed against his chest like a physical burden. This wasn't a typical missing person case where time had simply revealed new information. This was a resurrection with sinister implications that challenged everything he thought he knew about criminal investigation. The behind-the-scenes work of piecing together Sarah's impossible return required Hayes to think beyond conventional police procedures. How do you investigate the resurrection of someone who was supposedly dead? How do you build a case around evidence that defies logical explanation? The journey from that first shovel strike in the cemetery to understanding the full scope of what had happened would require Hayes to confront the darkest possibilities about human nature and institutional trust. The revelations emerging from Sarah's medical evaluation were painting a picture of systematic abuse and psychological conditioning that spanned over a decade. Her physical condition told one story, but her mental state revealed an even more complex narrative about the methods used to break down and rebuild a child's understanding of reality. Now, I want to examine the specific evidence that began to emerge from the hospital, because what the medical team discovered would provide the first concrete proof of the systematic nature of Sarah's captivity. Write in the comments, "Evidence never lies," if you're ready to learn what the medical examination revealed about Sarah's years of captivity. The human psyche has remarkable defense mechanisms that activate when reality becomes too overwhelming to process. Claire experienced this firsthand as she sat in her childhood bedroom, still wearing her wedding gown, unable to form coherent thoughts about what she had just witnessed. The dress, that should have been carefully preserved as a treasured keepsake, instead became her cocoon of grief and confusion, bunching around her like a snowdrift as she tried to make sense of the impossible. This transformation from bride to traumatized sister happened in a matter of minutes, but the emotional impact would last a lifetime. Claire found herself in the surreal position of mourning a death that never happened while simultaneously trying to accept the return of someone she had grieved for 12 years. Time seemed meaningless in her paralysis. Minutes felt like hours as her mind struggled to reconcile the bright, curious 9-year-old she remembered with the broken, traumatized teenager who had appeared like an apparition in the chapel garden. Behind the scenes at Millfield General Hospital, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. The medical team worked methodically to document every aspect of Sarah's condition, knowing that their findings would become crucial evidence in what was clearly going to be a complex criminal investigation. The decision to run DNA analysis wasn't just about confirming identity, It was about providing scientific proof of what everyone's hearts already knew to be true. When Dr. Patricia Williams finally delivered the DNA results to Helen Morrison, she faced the impossible task of using clinical language to convey a truth that defied comprehension. The laboratory confirmation was definitive. This was indeed Sarah Beth Morrison, the daughter the family had buried over a decade ago. But science couldn't soften the devastating revelation that accompanied this verification. Their daughter had been alive all these years, living in conditions that left visible scars on her malnourished body. The impact of this confirmation rippled through the Morrison family like aftershocks from an earthquake. Helen Morrison had to confront the horrifying reality that, while she had been visiting Sarah's grave, bringing flowers on birthdays and anniversaries, her daughter had been suffering somewhere in captivity. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. Every moment of grief over the past 12 years had been based on a lie, while the real tragedy was happening in real time, just beyond their reach. The journey from DNA confirmation to understanding the full scope of what had happened to Sarah would require the family to dive deeper into revelations that would challenge everything they believed about their community and the people they had trusted. Now, I want to explore the specific medical evidence that began to paint a picture of Sarah's captivity, because what the doctors discovered would provide the first concrete clues about the systematic nature of her imprisonment. Write in the comments, "Science reveals truth," if you understand how crucial medical evidence becomes in cases like this. The sterile hospital environment of room 213 became an unlikely confessional as Claire sat beside her sister's bed, preparing to hear truths that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the past 12 years. Sarah's revelations came in whispers, each word carrying the weight of a carefully constructed reality that had been built around her captivity. The impact of these conversations would ripple through Claire's consciousness, forcing her to confront the sophisticated mindset of someone who had systematically erased her sister's connection to the outside world. What makes this psychological manipulation so devastating is the way predators exploit fundamental human needs for safety and belonging. Sarah described being told that everyone she had ever loved was dead, that some kind of catastrophic event had wiped out the world above ground. Her captor had convinced her that the underground shelter wasn't a prison. It was salvation. This transformation of reality required years of careful conditioning, gradually replacing Sarah's memories of family and freedom with a manufactured narrative of divine protection. The journey from innocent child to indoctrinated captive reveals the calculated decisions made by her abuser. Sarah was told she was chosen, that her purpose was to eventually bear children who would repopulate a devastated world. The religious rhetoric wrapped around these crimes demonstrates how predators often use spiritual concepts to justify their actions, creating a twisted theology that makes victims complicit in their own abuse. Behind the scenes of Sarah's captivity lay a sophisticated system of psychological control that went far beyond physical imprisonment. Her captor had created an entire cosmology around her confinement, complete with explanations for why she couldn't leave, why the outside world was dangerous, and why her suffering served a higher purpose. This level of indoctrination requires not just isolation, but active rewriting of a victim's fundamental beliefs about reality itself. The hospital room couldn't contain the horror of what Sarah was revealing. Years of systematic conditioning had convinced her that her captivity represented divine will, that her body was a vessel for some twisted form of salvation. The transformation from family member to religious sacrifice had been so complete that Sarah struggled to accept that her memories of the Morrison family were real rather than hallucinations or dreams. Claire found herself in the impossible position of having to gently dismantle years of carefully constructed lies while helping her sister rebuild connections to a world she had been taught no longer existed. The revelations emerging from these conversations would soon lead investigators to understand that Sarah's case wasn't an isolated incident. Now, I want to examine the specific techniques used to maintain this level of psychological control, because understanding the methodology behind Sarah's indoctrination would become crucial to identifying the person responsible. Write in the comments, "Control through fear," if You recognize how predators use psychological manipulation to maintain power over their victims. The process of recovering suppressed memories often works like archaeological excavation, with the most significant discoveries buried deepest beneath layers of everyday recollections. As Claire sat in that hospital room, listening to Sarah's revelations about her real father, her mind began digging through childhood memories she hadn't accessed in years. Slowly, a face began to emerge from the shadows of Sunday school mornings and youth choir practices. Pastor David Wheeler, always smiling, always helpful, always just a little too interested in spending time alone with the young girls of Holy Trinity Chapel. This transformation of memory from innocent recollection to sinister recognition represents one of the most disturbing aspects of institutional abuse. Claire realized that Wheeler had been hiding in plain sight, using his position of trust and authority to gain access to children, while maintaining the perfect cover of religious devotion. The impact of this revelation was devastating, not just because it identified Sarah's captor, but because it forced Claire to confront how many warning signs the community had missed or ignored. Behind the scenes at the Millfield Police Department, Detective Hayes was making his own disturbing discoveries. The original case file on Sarah's disappearance read like a masterclass in overlooked evidence and investigative blind spots. As he spread the yellowed papers across his desk, one absence became glaringly obvious. Pastor Wheeler's name appeared nowhere in the documentation, despite his constant presence at the church and his regular interactions with children. The mindset that allows such oversights reveals a fundamental flaw in how society views religious figures. Hayes could see the decision-making process that had led investigators to focus on external threats while completely ignoring the possibility that danger might come from within the church itself. The original detectives had been so focused on looking for a stranger, a drifter, or someone from outside the community that they had failed to consider the people closest to the victim. This represents more than just investigative oversight. It demonstrates how predators deliberately choose positions that provide both access to victims and built-in protection from suspicion. Wheeler's role as pastor wasn't just his job, it was his perfect camouflage. The journey from trusted spiritual leader to suspected child predator would require Hayes to challenge not just the evidence, but the community's fundamental assumptions about authority and trust. The revelations emerging from both Claire's recovered memories and the case file review were painting a picture of systematic grooming and institutional protection that went far beyond a single act of kidnapping. Now, I want to explore the specific evidence that began to surface about Wheeler's activities at the church, because what investigators discovered would reveal a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years. Write in the comments, hidden in plain sight, if you understand how predators use positions of trust to avoid detection. The personnel files at Holy Trinity Chapel revealed a pattern that should have triggered immediate investigation, but instead had been buried beneath layers of administrative indifference and institutional protection. Pastor Wheeler's employment history painted a disturbing picture of a predator who had been operating in plain sight for nearly a decade. His resignation in 2001 wasn't just suspicious timing, it was a calculated decision that coincided perfectly with Sarah's disappearance, yet somehow no one had ever connected these obvious dots. What makes this oversight even more troubling is the discovery of Margaret Davies' complaint about Wheeler's inappropriate behavior with choir girls. Her concerns about private Bible study sessions and uncomfortable interactions had been documented, filed, and then effectively ignored. This represents a devastating failure of institutional accountability, where the comfort of maintaining appearances took precedence over protecting children. The transformation from spiritual guidance to predatory behavior had been gradual enough that warning signs were rationalized away or dismissed as misunderstandings. Behind the scenes, Detective Hayes was uncovering evidence that Wheeler's departure from Holy Trinity had been anything but coincidental. The building records from 2001 told an even more chilling story of deliberate planning and concealment. The chapel renovation that year wasn't just about modernizing the facility. It included the permanent sealing of a basement area that had originally been built in the 1950s as a community tornado shelter. The architectural drawings revealed the methodical mindset of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. What had once served as a legitimate safety feature for the community was transformed into something far more sinister. The 2001 renovation sealed off all access points to this underground space, creating what essentially became a tomb hidden beneath holy ground. The impact of this discovery was staggering. Wheeler hadn't just kidnapped Sarah on impulse, he had spent years planning and preparing a secret prison directly underneath the church where her family worshipped. This level of premeditation demonstrates the calculating nature of institutional predators. Wheeler's decision to use the chapel's own infrastructure for his crimes wasn't just convenient. It was genius in its audacity. Who would ever think to look for a missing child in the basement of the very church where memorial services were held in her honor? The journey from community shelter to private prison required not just construction skills, but an intimate understanding of how to exploit people's trust and assumptions. The revelations about Wheeler's activities were beginning to paint a picture of someone who had been methodically grooming victims and preparing for crimes long before Sarah's disappearance. Now, I want to examine the specific evidence that investigators found when they finally gained access to Wheeler's hidden underground chamber, because what they discovered would reveal the true scope of his operation. Write in the comments, "Planning reveals intent," if you recognize how calculated these actions were from the very beginning. The weight of suppressed guilt can transform a person's entire relationship with truth, and Helen Morrison had been carrying that burden for over a decade. Standing in her kitchen with tears streaming down her face, she finally confessed to Detective Hayes that she had suspected Pastor Wheeler all along. Her revelation about filing an anonymous complaint with Child Services after Sarah's disappearance exposed another devastating layer of institutional failure that had allowed a predator to continue operating undetected. This confession revealed the impossible position many parents find themselves in when confronting authority figures. Helen's decision to remain anonymous rather than make direct accusations demonstrated the powerful psychological barriers that protect institutional predators. The impact of social pressure, religious authority, and community standing had convinced her that anonymous reporting was safer than direct confrontation. Unfortunately, her attempt at action had been swallowed by bureaucratic indifference, another complaint filed away and forgotten while Wheeler continued his methodical abuse. The journey from suspicion to suppressed guilt to eventual confession shows how institutional abuse affects entire communities, not just direct victims. Helen had spent 12 years wondering if speaking up more forcefully could have prevented Sarah's disappearance, carrying the crushing weight of what-if scenarios that tormented her daily. Her transformation from protective mother to silent observer had been gradual, driven by a system that prioritized institutional reputation over child safety. Behind the scenes at Holy Trinity Chapel, Detective Hayes was about to uncover the physical evidence that would validate Helen's worst fears. Armed with architectural drawings and a court-issued warrant, he approached the sealed wall in the chapel annex with a crowbar and a growing sense of dread. The drywall that had hidden horrors for over a decade finally gave way under pressure, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. As Hayes descended those stairs, his flashlight illuminated what could only be described as the architecture of nightmare. The underground space had been methodically converted from a community tornado shelter into a sophisticated prison designed specifically for long-term captivity. Child-sized furniture, chains bolted directly into concrete walls, and desperate messages scratched into surfaces by imprisoned hands told a story of systematic abuse that spanned years rather than months. The mindset required to create such a space reveals the calculating nature of Wheeler's crimes. This wasn't an impulsive act of violence. It was a carefully planned operation that required construction skills, psychological manipulation, and an intimate understanding of how to exploit institutional trust. Now, I want to explore the specific evidence that investigators found carved into those basement walls, because the messages left by Sarah and potentially other victims would provide crucial insights into the scope of Wheeler's operation. Write in the comments, "Walls tell stories," if you understand how physical evidence can reveal the truth that victims couldn't speak aloud. The most powerful testimony in that underground chamber wasn't written in official reports or documented in case files. It was carved directly into concrete by a desperate child who refused to let her identity be completely erased. At the bottom of the hidden staircase, Detective Hayes discovered 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "I am not his daughter." Sarah had scratched this message into the wall using what investigators later determined was a nail or scrap of metal, creating a permanent declaration of resistance against her captor's psychological manipulation. This simple statement represents something profoundly significant about the human spirit's capacity to maintain truth even under the most extreme circumstances. Despite years of isolation, indoctrination, and abuse designed to break down her sense of self, Sarah had maintained enough clarity to assert her real identity. The transformation from victim to survivor began with this act of defiance, a child's desperate attempt to preserve the truth about who she really was beneath layers of imposed fiction. The impact of discovering this message extended far beyond its evidential value. It proved that Wheeler's psychological conditioning hadn't been completely successful, that somewhere deep inside, Sarah had always known the difference between her real family and her captor. Her decision to carve these words into permanent stone demonstrated a mindset of resistance that would prove crucial to her eventual recovery and rehabilitation. Behind the scenes at Millfield General Hospital, medical professionals were documenting the physical evidence that corroborated Sarah's underground ordeal. Dr. Williams delivered her findings with clinical precision, but the facts were devastating in their systematic nature. Sarah's body told a comprehensive story of prolonged abuse. Ligature marks around her wrists and ankles indicated chronic restraint. Burn scars were deliberately placed in patterns suggesting ritualistic punishment, and bone density tests revealed that her physical development had been stunted by years of malnutrition and trauma. The journey from medical examination to understanding the full scope of Sarah's captivity required doctors to think beyond typical abuse cases. This wasn't sporadic violence or neglect. It was methodical conditioning designed to maintain long-term control over a growing child. The revelations emerging from these medical reports would provide crucial evidence for prosecution, but more importantly, they would guide Sarah's path toward healing and recovery. The physical evidence painted a picture of someone who had experienced transformation through suffering, but whose core identity had remained remarkably intact despite years of systematic attempts to erase it. Now, I want to explore how Sarah's own memories and testimonies began to reveal the scope of Wheeler's operation, because what she remembered about other voices in that underground prison would shock investigators. Write in the comments, "Identity survives." If you believe that our core sense of self can endure even the most extreme attempts to destroy it, the power of art therapy to unlock traumatic memories often reveals truths that words cannot express, and Sarah's drawing became one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Working with stubby colored pencils in the hospital's therapy room, she created what appeared to be a simple child's drawing, but was actually a detailed map of her psychological imprisonment. The stick figure girl she drew was positioned underground beneath a clearly recognizable chapel, with a red X drawn over the figures. Mouth, a powerful symbol of enforced silence that had defined her captivity. What made this drawing even more disturbing was how Sarah depicted her captor. The man holding a book with a cross was completely faceless, suggesting that her mind had deliberately blocked his features as a protection mechanism. This transformation of memory into artistic expression revealed the sophisticated psychological defenses Sarah had developed to survive years of systematic abuse. The impact of seeing her trauma, documented in such stark, innocent imagery, was devastating for everyone involved in her care. Behind the scenes, therapists recognized that Sarah's decision to place herself beneath the chapel wasn't just geographic accuracy. It was a profound statement about how Wheeler had inverted everything sacred in her life. The very building where her family sought spiritual comfort had become the site of her imprisonment and abuse. Her mindset during captivity had been shaped by this twisted irony, living directly beneath the prayers and hymns of people who mourned her supposed death. The journey toward understanding the full scope of Wheeler's crimes took another devastating turn when Sarah began revealing details about other victims. Her mention of another girl, someone Wheeler had called sister, shattered any remaining hope that Sarah's case was an isolated incident. This other victim had apparently been with Sarah initially, sharing the underground prison until Wheeler decided she wasn't pure enough and removed her permanently. The revelation that Wheeler had been systematically selecting and disposing of children based on his twisted criteria exposed the calculated nature of his operation. Sarah's fractured memories suggested that this other girl had failed some kind of test, perhaps crying too much or resisting indoctrination more forcefully than Wheeler preferred. The transformation from victim to disposed evidence demonstrated a level of cold calculation that went far beyond opportunistic abuse. These revelations forced investigators to confront the possibility that Wheeler's underground chamber might contain evidence of multiple murders, not just long-term captivity. The decisions he made about which children to keep and which to eliminate revealed a predator who viewed his victims as disposable objects rather than human beings. Now, I want to examine what happened when investigators began searching for physical evidence of these other victims, because what they discovered beneath the chapel would confirm Sarah's worst memories. Write in the comments, "Memory tells truth," if you understand how trauma survivors often reveal crucial details through indirect methods like artwork. The forensics team's discovery beneath the sealed chapel basement represented every investigator's worst nightmare confirmed. As they carefully excavated the area under Sarah's mattress, what they uncovered was a shallow grave that had been hidden for over 2 decades. The small skeleton they extracted belonged to a girl estimated to be around 11 years old, dead since approximately 2002. This devastating revelation transformed the case from kidnapping and captivity into something far more sinister, a systematic pattern of child murder that had been operating directly beneath a place of worship. The impact of finding physical evidence of Wheeler's other victim couldn't be overstated. Sarah's fragmented memories about the girl called Sister were no longer just traumatic recollections. They were testimonies about a real child whose life had been brutally ended when she failed to meet Wheeler's twisted standards. The transformation from missing person to murder victim represented the ultimate consequence of Wheeler's selection process, revealing a predator who disposed of children like discarded objects when they no longer served his purposes. Behind the scenes, as investigators continued searching through decades of archived documents, they made another, chilling discovery that would haunt everyone involved. A misfiled letter from Margaret Davies written in 2001 had been buried in municipal records for over 20 years. Her handwritten warning read like prophecy that had been deliberately ignored by a system more concerned with institutional protection than child safety. What made Davies' letter so extraordinary was its uncanny accuracy in describing exactly what investigators had just uncovered. She wrote about suspicious behavior, underground spaces, and most eerily, about hearing humming through the floor during church services. This detail sent shivers through everyone who read it, because it meant that while families sat in pews above, praying and singing hymns, captive children were humming along from their underground prison directly beneath them. The mindset that allowed such a letter to be filed away and forgotten reveals the systemic failures that enabled Wheeler's crimes to continue for years. Davies had possessed enough insight to recognize the signs of institutional abuse, enough courage to document her concerns, but her warnings had been swallowed by bureaucratic indifference. Her journey from concerned observer to ignored whistleblower demonstrated how predators rely not just on their own cunning, but on society's reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths about trusted institutions. The revelations contained in Davies' letter would force investigators to re-examine every aspect of Wheeler's time at Holy Trinity Chapel, looking for patterns they had previously missed. Now, I want to explore what happened when Detective Hayes finally tracked down Wheeler's current location, because confronting the man responsible would reveal the disturbing psychology behind these systematic crimes. Write in the comments, warnings were ignored, if you recognize how institutional protection often silences those trying to expose the truth. The journey to track down Pastor Wheeler led Detective Hayes to an environment that seemed almost surreal in its normalcy. The Sunset Manor retirement community outside Columbus appeared to be the perfect setting for peaceful golden years. Manicured lawns, cheerful staff, and residents enjoying quiet activities in sun-filled common areas. Yet, somewhere within this picture of tranquil retirement lived a man whose transformation from trusted spiritual leader to child predator represented one of the most calculated cases of institutional abuse Hayes had ever encountered. Wheeler had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade, living comfortably under his real name without any attempt to conceal his identity. His single room was neat and unremarkable, filled with the typical possessions of elderly residents, family photos, religious books, and a television that provided his daily entertainment. The impact of discovering such an ordinary living situation was unsettling, because it demonstrated how easily monsters can blend into normal society once they've escaped the consequences of their actions. Behind the scenes of Wheeler's retirement facade lay the calculated mindset of someone who believed he had successfully evaded justice. His decision to live openly rather than hiding suggested either supreme confidence in his ability to avoid detection or a psychological detachment from the gravity of his crimes. The revelations that would emerge from Hayes's confrontation with Wheeler would prove that both assumptions were accurate. When Hayes finally sat across from Wheeler in the retirement home's quiet visiting room, what struck him most wasn't anger or denial. It was the pastor's unnaturally calm demeanor. Wheeler's response to being confronted with evidence of his crimes was perhaps more disturbing than rage would have been. He spoke of Sarah's captivity as if it were divine calling, describing the underground rooms as sanctuary rather than prison, and referring to his systematic abuse as purification rather than torture. The transformation from denial to justification revealed the complete nature of Wheeler's delusion. He genuinely believed that his actions had been not just acceptable, but divinely mandated. His journey from spiritual leader to predator hadn't involved a loss of faith. It had involved a twisted redefinition of religious purpose that allowed him to frame child abuse as sacred duty. The hidden truth emerging from this conversation was that Wheeler felt no remorse because he genuinely believed he had been serving a higher purpose. This level of psychological compartmentalization represents one of the most dangerous aspects of institutional predators, their ability to maintain complete conviction in their righteousness even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of harm. Now, I want to examine the specific techniques Wheeler used to maintain psychological control over his victims, because understanding his methods would prove crucial to helping Sarah and, potentially, identifying other survivors. Write in the comments, "Evil justifies itself," if you understand how predators use twisted logic to avoid taking responsibility for their crimes. The most chilling aspect of Wheeler's confession wasn't his admission of guilt, it was the calculated cruelty of his final predictions about Sarah's future. As Detective Hayes prepared to leave the retirement home, Wheeler delivered what could only be described as a psychological curse, warning that Sarah would never truly belong to the normal world. He claimed that his years of conditioning had made her for stillness, and that rescuing her had actually broken her beyond repair. The impact of these words carried the weight of both prophecy and threat, representing a final attempt to maintain control over his victim even from behind bars. This transformation from confession to prediction revealed the depth of Wheeler's psychological manipulation. His mindset remained focused on ownership and control, even when confronted with the consequences of his actions. The hidden truth behind his words was his genuine belief that he had permanently altered Sarah's capacity for normal human relationships and social integration. His decision to share these thoughts wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate attempt to plant seeds of doubt about Sarah's recovery potential in the minds of those trying to help her. Behind the scenes, Claire was making her own devastating discovery that would provide crucial insight into Sarah's mindset before her disappearance. While searching through old belongings, she found a note hidden inside Sarah's favorite childhood storybook, a yellowed piece of paper folded carefully between the pages. The note, written in Sarah's 9-year-old handwriting, revealed that she had understood her danger long before she vanished. The contents of this hidden message were heartbreaking in their clarity and desperation. Sarah had written that Wheeler told her, "God gave me to him," and included a desperate plea for help that no one had ever seen. This discovery forced the Morrison family to confront the painful reality that their daughter had been trying to communicate her fear and had taken the precaution of leaving evidence, hoping someone would eventually find it and understand what had happened to her. The journey from innocent child to someone who felt compelled to hide warning messages demonstrated how Wheeler's grooming process had created an atmosphere of fear and confusion that Sarah couldn't fully articulate to adults. Her decision to hide the note rather than directly tell her parents revealed the sophisticated psychological pressure Wheeler had already begun applying, convincing her that his attention was divinely sanctioned while simultaneously making her feel responsible for protecting herself. The revelations contained in this childhood note would prove crucial to understanding the timeline of Wheeler's predatory behavior and the methods he used to isolate potential victims. Now, I want to explore how investigators used this new evidence to uncover the broader scope of Wheeler's operation, because what they discovered would reveal a network of abuse that extended far beyond Millfield. Write in the comments. Children knew danger. If you recognize how victims often try to leave evidence when they can't directly ask for help. The ground-penetrating radar results that came back from Holy Trinity Chapel revealed a truth more horrifying than anyone had anticipated. What investigators initially thought was a single underground room turned out to be an entire subterranean complex beneath the chapel's rear altar wall. The radar detected 2 additional chambers connected by concrete passages and sealed with heavy wooden doors, representing a construction project that must have taken years to complete without detection. The transformation of the chapel's foundation from spiritual sanctuary to underground prison demonstrated the calculated mindset of someone who had been planning these crimes for decades rather than acting on impulse. Each newly discovered chamber revealed the scope of Wheeler's vision. This wasn't just about confining Sarah, but about creating a systematic operation for the long-term imprisonment and abuse of multiple children. The impact of realizing that an entire complex had been operating directly beneath a place of worship was devastating for everyone involved in the investigation. Behind the scenes, forensics teams worked methodically through each newly opened chamber, documenting evidence and searching for clues about the full extent of Wheeler's activities. What they discovered on the basement walls would haunt investigators for years to come. Scratched into the concrete with fingernails, makeshift tools, and whatever sharp objects the victims could find were children's names. Emma, Jessica, Rebecca, Lisa, names that carried the weight of forgotten lives. The journey from discovering these names to understanding their significance revealed one of the most disturbing aspects of Wheeler's operation. These weren't children who had been reported missing by frantic families or featured on news broadcasts. They were what society callously refers to as throwaway kids, runaways, foster children aging out of the system, and vulnerable minors whose absence went unnoticed by a world that had already failed to protect them. The hidden truth behind these carved names was that Wheeler had deliberately targeted children whose disappearances wouldn't trigger major investigations. His decisions about victim selection demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of which children society was most likely to overlook or dismiss. The revelations emerging from these basement walls forced investigators to confront the uncomfortable reality that some victims become invisible long before they're actually harmed. The basement walls served as an inadvertent memorial to lives that had been systematically erased from official records and public memory. Each name represented not just a victim of Wheeler's crimes, but a failure of social systems designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Now, I want to examine how Sarah's own memories began to provide crucial details about these other victims, because her recollections would help investigators understand the full timeline of Wheeler's operation. Write in the comments, "Every name matters," if you believe that no child should ever be considered disposable or forgettable by society. The most haunting aspect of Sarah's recovered memories wasn't the physical abuse she had endured, but her recollections of other voices in the underground chambers. As she worked with therapists to piece together fragmented memories, she began describing how other girls would sing hymns during their captivity, not from joy, but as a form of psychological survival. The transformation of religious songs from comfort to coping mechanism revealed how Wheeler had perverted every aspect of faith in his underground prison. What made Sarah's memories particularly devastating was her description of how these voices gradually disappeared over the years. She spoke of the singing, stopping one by one like lights going out, painting a chilling picture of a systematic elimination disguised as divine selection. The impact of these revelations forced investigators to confront the reality that Wheeler's operation had been ongoing for years, with him methodically disposing of children who failed to meet his twisted criteria for worthiness. Behind the scenes, news of the underground discoveries was beginning to reach families who had spent decades searching for answers about missing children. The hidden truth about Wheeler's crimes was finally surfacing, bringing both hope and horror to parents who had never stopped believing their children were out there somewhere. Carol Phillips represented the heartbreaking journey that countless families endure when children disappear without explanation. She arrived at the Morrison home carrying a photograph of her daughter Emma, who had vanished from Holy Trinity Chapel in 2003. For 21 years, Carol had refused to accept the official explanation that Emma was simply a runaway who didn't want to be found. Her maternal instincts had repeatedly led her back to the chapel, convinced that the building held answers about her daughter's fate. The transformation from dismissed grieving mother to validated truth seeker was both vindicating and devastating for Carol. Her decision to never give up searching had been ridiculed by authorities who preferred convenient explanations over complex investigations. The mindset that allowed officials to dismiss her concerns revealed the same institutional failures that had protected Wheeler for so long, a preference for simple answers that avoided uncomfortable questions about trusted community figures. Carol's persistent belief that Holy Trinity Chapel was connected to Emma's disappearance had been labeled as desperate delusion by investigators who found it easier to blame a troubled teenager than examine their own oversights. The revelations emerging from the basement discoveries proved that her maternal instincts had been tragically accurate all along. Now, I want to explore what happened when investigators were finally able to match Emma's name from the basement wall to Carol's missing daughter report, because this connection would open up an entirely new dimension of Wheeler's systematic crimes. Write in the comments, "Mothers always know." If you believe that parental instincts often recognize truth even when authorities dismiss their concerns. The dental record confirmation that Detective Hayes delivered to Carol Phillips represented one of those moments when truth brings both devastating closure and the beginning of a new kind of grief. After 21 years of searching, wondering, and hoping against hope, Carol finally had definitive proof that Emma's name carved into that basement wall belonged to her daughter. The transformation from missing person to confirmed victim was something no parent should ever have to experience. Yet Carol faced this revelation with a strength that spoke to the resilience of maternal love. What made Emma's identification even more disturbing was the condition in which her remains were found. Wheeler had buried her wearing a linen shift with a psalm pinned to her collar, revealing the ritualistic nature of his murders. This wasn't random violence or impulsive killing. It was systematic execution disguised as religious ceremony. The impact of discovering that Wheeler treated each murder as a sacrifice in his deluded spiritual fantasy added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible situation. Behind the scenes of this identification process, investigators were uncovering evidence that would reveal the most psychologically devastating aspect of Wheeler's operation. As Sarah continued working with therapists to recover suppressed memories, she began revealing details about her forced participation in Emma's final moments. The hidden truth emerging from these sessions was perhaps the cruelest element of Wheeler's methodology, his decision to make victims complicit in their own trauma. Sarah's revelation that she had been forced to help restrain Emma during her murder demonstrated the sophisticated mindset Wheeler employed to maintain psychological control. His manipulation had been so complete that he convinced a terrified 9-year-old that participating in another child's death was necessary for her own survival. This transformation of victim into unwilling accomplice represented a level of psychological torture that went far beyond physical abuse. The journey toward understanding how Wheeler maintained such complete control over his victims required investigators to confront the darkest aspects of human psychology. His decisions weren't just about satisfying violent impulses. They were calculated moves designed to create lasting trauma bonds that would ensure Sarah's silence and compliance. The revelations emerging from these therapy sessions showed how predators can weaponize guilt and survival instincts to create psychological chains stronger than any physical restraint. The burden of guilt that Sarah would carry forever wasn't just about her own victimization. It was about being forced to participate in the victimization of others, creating a complex web of trauma that would require years of specialized treatment to address. Now, I want to examine the broader network that enabled Wheeler's crimes to continue for so long, because investigators were beginning to discover that he hadn't been operating entirely alone. Write in the comments, trauma has layers. If you understand how psychological manipulation can create complex patterns of guilt and survival in victims. The transformation from suspicion to irrefutable evidence came when FBI investigators made a discovery that would haunt everyone involved in the case. Hidden within a sealed crate built into the basement wall, they found dozens of video cassettes, each one meticulously labeled with dates, names, and cryptic descriptions that would prove to be Wheeler's own documentation of his systematic crimes. The impact of realizing that Wheeler had been recording his abuse for years added a chilling dimension to the investigation. This wasn't just criminal behavior, it was criminal behavior that he was proud enough to preserve. The cassette labels told a story of methodical documentation that spanned over a decade. Each tape bore witness to Wheeler's obsessive need to record what he called purity tests, but what investigators immediately recognized as systematic torture and psychological conditioning of imprisoned children. Behind the scenes, FBI analysts worked in shifts to review the footage, a process so psychologically demanding that counseling support was provided for everyone involved in the viewing. The mindset revealed through these recordings demonstrated Wheeler's complete transformation from spiritual leader to predator, who viewed his crimes as religious calling. His decision to document everything wasn't just about personal gratification. It was about creating what he believed to be historical records of divine work. The journey from tape to tape revealed escalating patterns of abuse, sophisticated psychological manipulation, and a level of premeditation that shocked even experienced federal investigators. Even more disturbing than the video evidence were the handwritten journals investigators discovered in Wheeler's private study area. These carefully transcribed documents read like the manifesto of someone who genuinely believed himself to be divinely inspired. Page after page detailed his selection criteria for victims, his methods of conditioning, and his ultimate goal of creating what he called vessels of purity through systematic abuse and isolation. The hidden truth emerging from these journals was Wheeler's complete delusion about the righteousness of his actions. He had developed an entire theological framework to justify his crimes, referring to the underground chambers as the chosen room, and describing his victims as vessels meant to carry out divine purpose. His decisions about which children to keep, which to eliminate, and how to maintain psychological control were all documented with the precision of someone who believed history would vindicate his methods. The revelations contained within these journals forced investigators to confront the terrifying reality that Wheeler had operated with complete conviction in his righteousness, making him far more dangerous than an opportunistic predator. Now, I want to explore how this evidence was used to build the prosecution's case, because the legal battle to ensure Wheeler faced justice for his crimes would present unique challenges that prosecutors had never encountered before. Write in the comments, evidence builds truth if you understand how documentation can become a predator's own undoing in criminal cases. The breakthrough in understanding how Wheeler had managed such an elaborate operation for so many years came when Sarah identified Michael Foster, the former chapel custodian, as Wheeler's accomplice. This revelation transformed the investigation from a case about a single predator to a conspiracy involving multiple adults who had worked together to maintain the underground prison. Foster's position as custodian provided the perfect cover for the construction and maintenance activities that would have been impossible for Wheeler to manage alone. Behind the scenes, investigators began piecing together how Foster's legitimate access to building maintenance and renovation had enabled years of criminal activity to go undetected. His journey from trusted employee to criminal accomplice demonstrated how institutional predators often recruit helpers who can provide practical support while maintaining plausible deniability. The impact of this discovery was devastating for the community, as it meant that multiple trusted figures had been involved in the systematic abuse of children. The mindset required for Foster to assist in these crimes revealed the collaborative nature of institutional abuse. His decisions to help Wheeler weren't just about following orders. They represented a conscious choice to participate in the imprisonment and torture of children. The hidden truth about Foster's involvement explained how Wheeler had managed to construct and maintain such an elaborate underground complex without detection, requiring skills and access that went beyond what any single person could accomplish. The final chamber discovered beneath Holy Trinity Chapel revealed the true depth of Wheeler's depravity and the scope of his long-term planning. Contractors working on the complete excavation of the basement uncovered a hexagonal room that defied easy categorization. Unlike the sleeping quarters and holding areas, this chamber featured hooks mounted in the walls, a concrete basin in the center, and architectural details that clearly indicated ceremonial purposes rather than simple imprisonment. The transformation from practical prison to ritual space demonstrated that Wheeler's crimes had escalated far beyond the psychological conditioning documented in his journals and videos. This hexagonal chamber, with its carefully planned layout and specialized fixtures, had been designed for ceremonial abuse that represented the culmination of his twisted theological beliefs. The revelations emerging from this discovery forced investigators to confront the possibility that Wheeler's operation had included ritualistic elements that went far beyond individual abuse. The journey from custodial maintenance to criminal conspiracy, combined with the discovery of spaces designed for ceremonial torture, painted a picture of systematic evil that had been operating beneath the surface of a trusted community institution. Now, I want to examine how the community of Millfield began to grapple with the reality that their most trusted institutions had harbored such systematic evil, because the social impact of these revelations would transform the town forever. Write in the comments, "Evil needs help," if you understand how institutional abuse often requires multiple people working together to maintain secrecy. The power of ritual and remembrance often provides the pathway toward healing that survivors need to reclaim their lives, and Sarah's decision to visit the demolished chapel site represented a crucial step in her journey from victim to survivor. Standing among the rubble where Holy Trinity Chapel once stood, she performed her own ceremony of remembrance that was both deeply personal and profoundly meaningful for everyone who witnessed it. The transformation of this sacred ground from place of worship to crime scene to memorial site demonstrated how truth can ultimately redeem even the most corrupted spaces. The pressed flower that Sarah placed in the disturbed earth carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond its simple beauty. This single gesture served as a memorial not just for Emma and the other victims whose names had been carved into basement walls, but for all the children whose stories would never be fully known or understood. Behind the scenes of this quiet ceremony lay years of therapeutic work, family support, and the gradual rebuilding of trust that had allowed Sarah to reach this moment of peaceful closure. The impact of Sarah's healing journey extended far beyond her individual recovery. Her decision to work with law enforcement agencies investigating similar cases across the region marked her transformation from victim to advocate, ensuring that other children's voices would be heard, even when they could no longer speak for themselves. The mindset required for this level of service demonstrated remarkable resilience and a determination to prevent other families from experiencing the horror that had defined her childhood. Winter snow began falling on Holy Trinity Cemetery as the Morrison family gathered for what would be their final visit to the graves of Emma and Grace Elizabeth Morrison. another sister whose remains had been discovered during the excavation. The white blanket covering the newly marked headstones seemed to bless these children who had finally found peace after decades of being hidden in darkness. The journey from unmarked graves to proper burial represented more than just procedural closure. It was a restoration of dignity and recognition for lives that had been systematically erased. The revelations emerging from Sarah's case had ripple effects throughout the region, inspiring other survivors to come forward and helping investigators identify patterns of institutional abuse that had been operating in multiple communities. Her courage in sharing her story became a beacon of hope for others who had been silenced by trauma, fear, or the systematic destruction of their ability to trust authority figures. Now, I want to explore the lasting impact that this case had on how institutions approach child protection, because Sarah's story would ultimately change policies and procedures designed to prevent similar tragedies. Write in the comments, "Survivors become heroes," if you believe that those who overcome trauma can become powerful advocates for preventing future harm. Sarah's story reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit's capacity for resilience can illuminate paths toward justice and healing. Her transformation from silenced victim to powerful advocate proves that survivors don't just overcome their trauma, they often become the very people who prevent others from experiencing similar harm. The changes that emerged from this case extended far beyond Millfield, Ohio. New protocols for investigating missing children, mandatory reporting requirements for institutional employees, and enhanced background screening procedures all trace their origins back to the lessons learned from Sarah's ordeal. Her courage to speak truth about unspeakable experiences created ripple effects that continue protecting children today. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I thank you. Understand something important about the power of truth and the responsibility we all share to protect the vulnerable. Stories like these aren't easy to hear, but they're essential to understand. When we look away from uncomfortable truths, we create the very conditions that allow predators to operate undetected. I share these cases because knowledge becomes protection when we're willing to confront difficult realities together. If this kind of investigative storytelling resonates with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to join our community of people who believe that truth, however painful, deserves to be told. Your support helps me continue bringing these important stories to light. If you made it all the way to the end, write "Truth protects the innocent" in the comments. I read every single one and appreciate knowing that these stories are reaching people who understand their importance. And if this conversation created the kind of connection I hoped it would, a like helps me. Know that we're building something meaningful together here. There's a video right here that dives even deeper into how institutional abuse cases are investigated and prosecuted. Click and continue with me over there, because there's so much more to understand about how justice works when it finally arrives.